للعالمين.
All right, so let's come full circle and bring this now back to how we actually began, which was with some Python code. So it turns out these are not either or decisions. It turns out in the real world, developers are constantly using 1, 2, 3 languages at once. In fact, next week I rattled off HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, one of which is a proper programming language, but those languages are often used together. Totally normal and common to use Python and SQL, or Java in SQL, or Swift in SQL, or any number of different combinations with a database language. You might use your preferred programming language, Java, Python, C++, to create the user interface and the logic that builds that implements the program itself. But for your data, like SQL is a really good candidate. And indeed, we've seen already that SQL can just speed up certain operations. You can collapse 15 lines of code into just one, and you can use these things together. So let me come back to, I'm going to quit out of SQLite. I'm going to minimize my terminal window. And here's where we left off before with favorites.py. With favorites.py, everything was being stored in favorites.csv. And recall that we eventually imported that CSV file into favorites.db automatically with .import, just so we can start playing around with SQL. But we can now tie these two together, and a way to do that is as follows. CS50 has a library for Python. You might recall having available getString, getInt, getFloat. You don't strictly need to use them in Python because it's much easier to just use the input function and then try, accept, and convert things to int or float or the like. But it's a lot more work to use SQL in Python without a third-party library. A lot of the commercial options or popular open source options are actually just complicated to use. So CS50 does have a very useful function inside of its library for Python that you should use and must use for the problem set that just makes it easy to execute execute SQL inside of your Python code. But it's built on top of a very popular open source alternative. So you can use that too in the real world. So the documentation for that's at this URL here, but I'll show you what we need to know here by focusing back on favorites.py. So what I'm going to do here as follows is this. Let me delete everything from favorites.py except for, let's say, this. From CS50, import SQL in all caps. So that's importing a SQL feature from CS50's library that's going to allow me to open a DB file in code. How do I do that? Well, let me create a variable called DB for database, though I could call it anything I want. Let me call this SQL function and pass in, using special syntax that's not CS50 specific, it's an industry thing, SQLite : ///. Unlike every other URL you type, this one literally has 3 in this context here. And then the name of the database, which in this case is favorites.db. So this is just a way of telling this SQL library that we wrote, but that works exactly like third-party alternatives, open favorites.db using the SQLite technology, if you will. All right, let's just ask the user a question. Give me your favorite problem. So we're going to use input instead of getString, but we could use getString, but they're pretty much the same for our purposes. Let's ask the user for their favorite. And now, in Python code, let us select from favorites.db all of the rows where students specify that problem as their favorite. So in SQL alone, it would be this. Select star from favorites where problem equals, and I'll do, well, whatever my favorite's going to be, like problem equals Mario, for instance. So if I were just using SQL, I would literally write something like that. But I'm in a .py file now. Like I have to use Python syntax. But Python supports strings. SQL is just text. It's just a string. So I could certainly just put my SQL code in a string, perhaps, and then pass it to a Python function. And here's the bridge between the two. If you just treat SQL as any old text, we can put it in a string and execute it. So let me actually do this. Let me go ahead and create a variable called rows, which is eventually going to contain all the rows from the database. Let me go ahead and select db.execute. This is the one function you need to know about inside of CS50's library, and it literally executes a SQL statement. And then in quotes, you pass it literally what you want to execute. And let me go ahead and close the parenthesis at the end there. And now let me just try this. So for row in rows, let's iterate over all of the rows. Let me go ahead and print out, how about row quote unquote. And what do I want here? Let's print out the timestamp of that person for kicks. All right, let me open my terminal window. Python of favorites.py, crossing my fingers here for sure. Enter. There we go, favorites. So I'll type in Mario. OK, so I got back, it's not very interesting, but I got back all of the timestamps of students who typed in Mario that we imported into this database. Well, what I really care about is how popular Mario is. So let me change this a little bit. Let me change this to count the number of rows. And let me keep it simple. Let me give an alias like I proposed earlier, like as n, where n is a number, so that now down here, I can actually just do this, print out the value of n. All right, let me go back to my terminal window, run Python of favorites.py. Let me type in Mario, enter. OK, 39. Now, technically, I'm cheating. Like, honestly, if I'm executing select count, we've seen before, it only ever returns one row, not multiple. So there's really nothing to iterate over. But it's working fine. It's just iterating once, but I'm getting lucky. So technically, what I should probably just do is this. I should probably give myself like a variable called row, set it equal to the very first row and only row that came back, and now print out that row's n column. Let me rerun the program. I'll type in Mario again, enter, and I still see 39. So this, of course, I don't strictly need to do this. I don't really need a variable. I can do rows bracket 0 instead. But let me focus on what this library is now doing. So per the documentation, what the CS50 execute function always does for you is it returns a list of dictionaries. So if your query returns nothing, like no matches, you get back an empty list. Like open bracket, close bracket, nothing in it. Any loop is not going to execute anything useful because there's nothing in it. If, though, you get back one row, you're going to get back a list of size 1, inside of which is a single dictionary. That dictionary is going to have keys that correspond to whatever you selected, be it the columns or the count. So when I selected star before, I would have gotten all of the columns. That's how I was able to access timestamp. Here, I'm just selecting count, and I don't want to have to type this down here. That would just look kind of atrocious. It would work, but it would look weird to just keep retyping count paren star close paren. So I just created an alias called n just to like make my life easier or cleaner down here. So to be clear, the CS50 execute function returns a list of dictionaries when you're using select, and that is how I can now get back the first and only row and then print out that row's n value. It is identical to, let me do this. Let me highlight this whole line of text. Let me, in my terminal window, run SQLite 3 of favorites.db like we did before break. Let me just copy paste this query, enter. That's the table I got back earlier when we played with SQL manually. And so when I get back this table, here's the key, here's the value. And I only have one row, which is why I'm just blindly indexing into rows bracket 0, because I know there's always going to be an answer there. It's going to be 0 or 1 or more. But I know now it's going to be called n because of this here. So what have I just done? Well, this is SQL down here. And this is just me being like a data scientist asking questions about my data, just using like black and white SQL queries. This is me now being a Python programmer who wants to talk to a SQL database using Python. And the bridge we're using happens to be this CS50 library. But again, there's third-party free libraries you can also use as well. Ours is just very simple. And indeed, the documentation will explain how execute behaves a little differently for inserts, updates, and deletes. You don't get back a list because you're not selecting anything, but you do get back some return values. Questions on this? That's the last of our Python code that ties everything together in spirit. Yeah? What this one here? Yes, so db.execute, by definition, returns a list of rows. And each of those rows happens to be a dictionary because it's convenient, key value pairs. If I'm selecting the count of rows, I just know from having learned SQL an hour ago that this is always going to give me a single row whose column in this case is called n. So if I know it's a single row, I can just blindly, just like in C, go into that list or an array in C and go to the first location and then treat that as the single row. What you don't want to do is this. Even if you, the human, know the query returns one row, you can't just magically change the variable name to be singular and expect to have only one value. You will always have a list. So even if there is only one value in it, it's up to you to do something like this to get at it. Or if you prefer more succinctness, you can do rows bracket I bracket n. That'll achieve the same thing without a variable. Yeah? Good. So I have been misleading this whole time and cheating because this is only ever going to return Mario. I'm ignoring the favorite that the human typed in here on line 5. So let me fix that. And that's going to lead us to some of the problems that arise ultimately with SQL. The right way to solve that problem, let me get rid of my terminal window here. The right way to solve this problem is not to use an F string like we did in Python generally, because SQL queries, as we'll see in a moment, can be dangerous. When you want to plug in users' data into a query that you've written most of in advance, you should, you must, you had better use a placeholder, namely a question mark in this case. This is somewhat specific to CS50's library, but we just borrowed the convention that like every other library uses too. In the world of SQL, single question marks are used as placeholders. And the way you do this is as follows. If you want to plug in a value for that question mark, just like in printf in C, you specify as a second or a third or a fourth argument all of the values you want plugged into this. So in C, weeks ago, we were using %s. Same exact idea. In SQL, it's a question mark that you use instead. This now, if I open back my terminal window and I run python of favorites.py, type in Mario, I should still get 39. But now I can also type in Scratch, perhaps, and get 44 for that very first piece at 0. And that one is even more popular here. So this now is correct. It would work to use an F string here and then plug in a value like favorite here. But you'll see in just a moment, don't do that. You will expose yourself to potential hack or attacks by trusting the user's input.